More than 746 million miles from Earth, a moon orbits the planet Saturn, Iapetus. Iapetus stands out from other moons because of its unusual and distinct shape. Around the moon's equator runs a ridge, giving the moon the appearance of semi-spherical halves welded together. Just above the equator lies a huge crater. On a moon whose diameter is 892 miles, a crater with a 250-mile diameter creates a distinctive appearance. These unusual features have led some to speculate that the moon may be of artificial origin. Iapetus is named after a hybrid being in Greek mythology, half human, half god. Also in orbit around Saturn is Iapetus' neighbor, another hybrid being from Greek mythology, the smaller moon Mimas. Like Iapetus, the surface of Mimas is dominated by an enormous crater, 80 miles in diameter, on a moon only 246 miles across. Before the first photographic images of Iapetus were returned to Earth by the NASA probes Voyager in 1981 and Cassini in 2004, no human eye had ever seen its unusual form. Except for the millions who in 1976 and every year since have seen it in Star Wars. Because if you look at the Death Star in Star Wars, you're looking at Iapetus de-aged by several thousand years. And the resemblance is so striking that with regard to Mimas, the sister moon, even NASA acknowledges the resemblance on its webpage. How did George Lucas have such a clear image of Iapetus and a story to explain it 30 years before any human had seen it? Well, I guess you can say there are three possibilities, and one is that it's just a coincidence, and I'll leave it to your imagination if you find that persuasive. The second possibility is that George Lucas had some inside information, that he had seen Iapetus before the rest of us first saw it as a fuzzy dot in 1981 from Voyager, and then in much greater detail around 2004, 2007, and 2010. And it certainly wouldn't be the first time that classified information was passed to a movie maker or a scriptwriter. So that may be possible. But the explanation I lean to is this, that when our minds go into storytelling mode, we somehow download accurate information from a wider field of consciousness. Now, I like that explanation for three reasons. And the first is to do with Plato. The second is to do with a friend of mine called Pilgrim. And the third is because of something that happened to me when I was 20 years old. So I'm sharing these things with you, not as any kind of a proof, but just to explain why I personally can accept that something interesting happens to human consciousness when we allow our minds to go into storytelling mode. So let me begin with Plato. Plato is an amazing writer. I think everybody should read Plato. And I love how he writes because he proceeds really on the basis of logic applied to things we have all observed. And from those first principles, he arrives at the most far-reaching and profound conclusions. One of his conclusions is that the material universe exists in order for consciousness to experience itself. Now we, as part of that material universe, as human bodies, exist as hosts for consciousness. Our bodies are processors for consciousness. Now, there's been a lot of research done in the last decade on out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences that show that consciousness and the body are not the same thing. and that while consciousness is supported by the body, it's not dependent on the body. Out-of-body experiences show that we can see without eyes and hear without ears. Now, when our bodies stop working, they stop hosting our consciousness. But all the time that our bodies are working, they host and process our consciousness, and I would suggest that they can receive a wider consciousness and maybe even divine consciousness. And this is where we come to the story of my friend Pilgrim. Now, Pilgrim, in the 1970s, went on a UK TV show called University Challenge. And on that show, you'd have a team from 2 universities, and they'd go up against each other with questions on their specialist subjects and on general knowledge. And Pilgrim told me something amazing that happened to him. He got into a flow where questions were just being fired at him like that, and he was giving answer after answer after answer, and he came out with a top score. But when he came off the set, he said to his teammates, "I don't know what just happened. I did not know those answers. Some of the names of people that I gave as answers, I've never heard of them." Somehow, he had got his mind into the place where he was downloading information from a wider consciousness. Now, if we, our bodies, are consciousness sponges, consciousness processors, then I have a framework for thinking how that might work. Now, I happen to believe that in our storytelling, we can flick that switch as well and download accurate information. When I was 17, I became a Christian, and at that time there was a wonderful renewal going on in the churches in which unusual experiences of the Spirit of God were becoming more usual. And part of what we witnessed as young people as this was going on was people who could somehow download accurate information from divine consciousness, so that when they were speaking or praying for a person, they would have accurate information that they could not possibly know by any normal, natural means. And we were very impressed by it. We couldn't do it, but we were very impressed. And the nearest we could come to it was just to make fun of it and make a game of it, which we used to do. And we would pretend to have amazing revelations for one another, just for fun, just as a game. Well, one day I did this to somebody that I didn't know at all. Now, this is a story against myself. This happened when I was much younger, when I was about 20 years old. And it's not something I'm proud of, but I'm telling you because you look trustworthy. Don't tell anybody. So what happened was this. I went up to this young guy, and just as part of this game, I said, "Phil, I think maybe you've had a traumatic experience recently with and then I just let my mind go into freewheel, into storytelling mode. And I said, "With a peach." And to my amazement and shock, his face fell and he went pale. And he said, "How on earth did you know that?" And of course I realized, oh my goodness, I've done something stupid here. I've stumbled into something. So I just tried to play it cool, and I said, "Phil, why don't you tell me?" And so Phil told me. And what had happened is that his girlfriend had been pinched by some other bloke, taller, more handsome, Smooth Jack, we'll call him. And Phil was really upset by this and somehow wanted to get revenge on Smooth Jack. Well, his opportunity came not long after. It was the town fair, and there were going to be floats going through the main street of the town, and Smooth Jack was on one of those floats. And so Phil hid himself in the crowd with an overripe peach, which he lobbed at Smooth Jack and knocked him over. Didn't fall off the float, thank goodness. He wasn't injured, but just very shocked and embarrassed. Well, Phil felt so terrible about that. He'd carried around this terrible guilt because he had done this terrible thing with the peach. And now here I was saying, "Have you had an experience with a peach?" Well, when he told me that, I didn't know where to put myself. So I just said to him, "Phil, look, I think I think God wants you to know He loves you, He completely understands, and He forgives you. And that was what I said to him. But when I went away from that, I thought, what on earth just happened? Because the moment I let my mind go into storytelling mode, I downloaded some accurate information about that guy, either from divine consciousness or from a wider consciousness. And that made me reflect on what human consciousness is and what storytelling is. And that might seem like a bizarre kind of example to share with you, but through my years in ministry, I've seen a lot of preachers do this, where they will be preaching and then they will bring in stories off the top of their head. And I've done this so many times through the years, where I've gone into a church that I do not know, and I preach and I bring in some stories, and afterwards people line up and say, how on earth did you know that about us? And the answer is, I didn't. But in storytelling, we start telling truths without knowing that's what we're doing. I would suggest that to some degree, all storytelling does that. But in particular, I would say it must be true of the stories that have lasted. The stories that last because they're telling us truth about ourselves. And that's one of the reasons I'm so interested in the world's mythologies. Today, there are some who suggest that Iapetus is not the only artificial planetoid to be studied. To find one, they say, one has to look no further than the moon. The moon is considered an anomaly by astrophysicists for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is very unusual for a planet the size of Earth to have a moon the size of our moon, being a sixth the size of planet Earth. This relationship is only possible because of the anomalous low density of the moon. Questions remain as to the formation of the moon. Why does it have this low density, and where was it formed? In mainstream science, there are three main theories about the formation of the moon. And the first is that the moon was formed from out of a cloud of debris that was in orbit around planet Earth, and it gradually condensed into the moon that we know today. The second theory is that planet Earth was involved in a collision with another planet, and that what was knocked off formed into the moon. The third theory is that the moon actually formed in a completely different part of the galaxy, and at some later point was captured by Earth's gravity and just somehow ended up in this perfect orbit where the size of the moon and its distance from Earth means that it exactly eclipses the sun periodically, where it's no bigger and no smaller than the appearance of the sun in the sky. It's captured so precisely that it always shows the same face to us as it orbits the Earth. So it's a pretty remarkable capture, which leads some to ask, was it captured by accident or by design? But what's not to be missed is that all those three mainstream theories argue that there was a time when planet Earth did not have the moon that we all know today. And that's a mind-boggling thought, because surely the arrival of the moon in Earth's gravitational field would cause cataclysms on planet Earth. And yet, you don't have to go far to find ancient historians who speak of a time before the arrival of the moon. Aristotle, Apollonius, Democritus, Anaxagoras, writing between the 3rd and 5th century BCE, all speak about a time before the moon arrived in Earth's orbit, and they speak about a population of Homo sapiens resident on Earth in Greece at the time of the moon's arrival, and these people were referred to as the Proselenes. Plutarch, the historian, Ovid, the poet, the writer Censorinus, all refer back to these pre-lunar populations, the Proselines, and they're not doing it as mythology, they're referring to this as history. Now, of all those, the one that really interests me is Apollonius, because he relates the arrival of the moon in Earth's orbit with planet Earth's most recent planetary cataclysm. And that relates to what Plato wrote, because he argued that planet Earth gets reset, in terms of human civilization, gets reset to a virtual zero every 5,000 years or so as a result of the movement of space objects. And the word he uses for space objects could be an asteroid, could be a moon. So among those mainstream Roman and Greek historians, you've got ancestral memory recorded that the moon was formed in a different part of the galaxy and was at a later stage captured by Earth's gravity. Now, they claim to be speaking from memory, but I've got another example of storytelling that seems to access accurate information, and it's in the Zulu legend of Mutwa and Umpanku. Credo Mutwa is a revered African elder. He is a shamanic leader of the Zulu people and a curator of their mythologies. And he tells the story of Mutwa and Umpanku, two brothers who steal an egg from the ancient fire dragon. And this is the story of the moon. And then they empty it of its yolk and roll it across the sky until it arrives in orbit around planet Earth. Now, what I find fascinating about that mythology is that it addresses all the questions that researchers are still probing today. It speaks about the formation of the moon in another part of the galaxy. It speaks about its anomalous low density, that it's been emptied of its yolk. And then it speaks about its arrival in Earth's orbit. Now, it could be that our Zulu ancestors who recorded that story had been given inside knowledge from another source. I believe that's entirely possible because I believe that contact has been there. But it is also possible that in their storytelling, they somehow managed to download accurate information from a wider field of consciousness, just as Pilgrim did on that quiz show, just as I did with that fake word for my friend Phil, and maybe just as George Lucas did when he told us the story of the Death Star. Is it possible that in the storytelling of the world's mythologies, accurate information about our cosmos has been somehow downloaded into human consciousness? I would suggest that the parallels between factual Iapetus and fictional Death Star, and factual low-density moon and fictional egg emptied of its yolk, suggests that you and I should be listening to mythologies, ancient and modern, with a far more open mind.
Author and researcher Paul Wallis probes the world's ancient mythologies for clues about the origins of the human race, and has published several books in the field of mysticism and spirituality. In the last decade, his work has probed the world's ancient mythologies for the insights they hold on our origins as a species and our potential as human beings. Go to www.paulanthonywallis.com for information about Paul and his books.